Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to begin the process of installing the top end, that being pistons, rings, cylinders, and cylinder heads on the little Yamaha YL1. This might be a multi-part video before it's over. I'm not sure because I'm just getting started. We'll see how this goes, but don't be surprised it's not a several-part series. I believe I've talked about the piston kit I bought once before, but just by way of review, in case you didn't see that video, I bought an aftermarket kit off of eBay some time ago. This is 1mm or 4th oversize. This came as a kit. It didn't include the wrist pin or gudgeon pin bearings. That's what these are right here. But it did include the piston. Believe it or not, it came with these Yamaha OEM rings. And the piston kit itself also comes with the wrist pin or gudgeon pin and then the circlips, I think you can see right there, that go with it. So it came with everything but the wrist pin bearings. I bought these separate on eBay. They're pretty common out there. They're not terribly expensive, and these are two OEM Yamaha wrist pin bearings. This first video, what I'm going to do today is we're going to install the piston rings. Now again, this is a 1mm, you can see it, oversized, 4th over. That's as far over as this engine is designed to go, according to Yamaha at least. You will notice right there on the top of the piston, that arrow, that points to the exhaust side of the cylinder, or it'll point forward in this case. That's quite important. So you always want to pay attention to the direction of the arrow. And virtually all pistons will have an arrow, at least 2-stroke, will have an arrow pointing towards the exhaust port. The rings, there's two different types of rings here, and I think you can see that. One of them is just plain hardened, I don't know if that's steel or iron, I don't know what it's made of, but it's what they call a hardened ring. And the second ring is a chromed ring. I think you can see that there. It's not polished, of course, but there are two different rings used on these bikes. Now, if you look at the original Yamaha repair manual, and that's what this is. This is a Yamaha service manual. I have several of these aftermarket, that being I think it's a climber manual, as well as the original Yamaha. It does speak to the difference of these rings, and let me get this up here for you. It says fitting the rings, fit the first, the number 2, or the hardened. That would be the black ring right here, over the piston. So that would go on first. So that would go on the bottom or second groove. And then the number 1 or the chrome ring. So in other words, to make this nice and simple, the hardened ring goes in the bottom and the chrome ring goes in the top. I did mic these, or use my caliper rather, I didn't use a micrometer, and they are exactly the same width, and the groove in the piston is the same, the ring groove is the same also. So these could be interchanged, but obviously they're not supposed to be. You will also see a pin right there, and there's another one here somewhere right there. So the top ring has the pin right there, the bottom ring has the pin right there. And that's to locate the gap in the ring. So let's take a look at one of the original pistons for a moment. This happens to be the right piston that I pulled out of the bike. This is the one that's intact. We've talked about this before. You can see how the rings are arranged, and that is the taper goes up, and I don't know if you can see that pin right there, but you can see how that ring fits around that pin, and then the same on the top. You can see, I think, right there. Now on these two rings, and I don't know if these are original Yamaha rings, this was the second oversize. I don't know if these are original rings or aftermarket. You can't really tell the difference easily by looking at them. You can see the top one right here has a little bit of a shine to it. That would suggest, it's not conclusive, but it would suggest that that is the chrome ring, and whoever put these rings on probably got them in the right orientation. You can see a little bit of a shininess right there on the top ring as well. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to reset up a little bit. I'm going to show you putting the rings on. I've already done one piston here, and you can see I've marked it. This one already has the rings on, and I put a red mark where that pin is right here, and another one over here where the other pin, and then on the top I just wrote T for top and B for bottom. That locates that bottom pin. So if I'm looking from the top, I know the bottom ring groove, the B, is right here, and I know the top ring pin in the groove is right here. It's just for my awareness and make it a little bit easier for me to explain it to you. We've briefly reviewed the piston kit and the parts that we have to work with. What I'm going to do here now is change the setup, and I'm going to install these rings on this piston. Just a point of observation, I find it's much easier when possible to install the rings on the piston when the piston's off the bike. Now in some cases, if you're doing a rebuild or freshening of a top end with the pistons already mounted on the bike, this doesn't make any sense usually to pull the pistons off to put the rings on. In that case, you would do it with pistons installed, but it's simpler, I find, in this case. It's obvious because the pistons haven't been mounted yet, to go ahead and install off the bike, and then I will mount the pistons with the rings installed on the bike, onto the connecting rods as the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and change the setup here a little bit to give you a better perspective, and we'll go ahead and put these two rings. So I went and fetched my inexpensive vise. I think you've seen this before when I did the wiring restoration for this project. A freestanding vise like this, it's not bolted down, I just keep it off to the side. It's quite handy for things like this. It gives you enough mass to hold parts, yet it's relatively portable and easy to work with, versus having sometimes a vise that's bolted down. What I'm going to do first is take a couple of pieces of foam. This is just construction foam like you see used in the walls of homes. It's very soft, as you can see here. And I have quite a bit of this left over from when I built my shop about 10 years ago, and I just have it up in the rafters of my pole barn. And it's very useful for clamping delicate parts. I'm going to use it to clamp this piston. You'll see here in a moment. You don't have to use foam. You could use blocks of wood. You could use anything that's reasonably soft. Pad your jaws. That's really what you're after here. I have taken some two-phase tape. Again, I have a roll of this in my shop, and the reason I'm using two-phase tape is I want to just stick this foam temporarily up against the jaws. I don't want it to be permanent. I want it to be removable. So if I can get this tape separated here, we'll see if we can't stick this onto this this jaw. Like that. Again, that's intended to be temporary. Then what I'm going to do is use these soft jaws to hold the piston in place like that so it doesn't move around. And you can position the piston wherever you want that makes the most sense for you. It's the most convenient for you. You can do it like that. You can tighten it up pretty much as tight as you want because the foam is going to compress way before that piston does. And yet it will provide a very secure grip. As you can see there. I'm going to go ahead and take my red Sharpie and I'm going to locate those pins, and there's the bottom one right there. Right B for bottom, and right here T for top. Probably not absolutely necessary, but It's a little more visual. See how that looks right there. And I'm going to position the piston with the pins facing me so that when I go to put the rings on, it's a little more obvious both to you and to me. So I'm just going to tighten that up. You might be able to hear the foam crush, and that's exactly what I want because I want that piston secure. I do not want it to move. There are available commercial piston ring expanders. I don't use them very often. The idea is that you would take your rings, your piston rings, and you would fit them in. These don't fit. These rings are a little bit too small. But you put them in something like that, and then you expand it, and then you slip it down over the piston. That's the intent. On a small piston like this, and this is about as small as they get. I think I've worked on chainsaws that have had bigger pistons than this. This tool really kind of gets in the way, as you can, I think, maybe just see right there. Let me expand that for you just a little bit. I'll show you what I mean. It kind of gets in the way here, the jaws, and I don't want to expand this ring any more than I have to. So on larger rings, these work fine, but these are a little bit too small, a little bit too delicate. So I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. I'm just going to expand the rings with my fingers. See if we can get you in the shot here a little bit. So I'm going to do my best not to get my head in the way. We have the ring groove in the correct orientation. That is, it's not flipped. We got the V shape pointing up. And now I need to expand this ring just enough to slip it over the crown of the piston and get it started down into the grooves. There. So the first piston ring is on, and the opening of the ring is aligned with the pin. There's the second ring right there. We're going to do the exact same thing, and this one is going to be a little easier because we don't have to go past that first ring. Again, here's the pin. And we've got them both installed, as you can see. There and there. So that's one of our first milestones, getting the rings installed. Next operation will be done over at the bike, and we will be installing these pistons into the connecting rod. First thing I want to share with you, and I'm not sure if I've shared this before, I might have, but you'll notice these rubber bands, these colorful rubber bands. I've got 2 on each cylinder, and they crisscross, and they are just stretched over the cylinder studs like you see here. And the purpose of these rubber bands, and watch what happens when I turn the engine over, they prevent the connecting rods from, flopping around in there like this and banging against the cases. So as you work with the engine, before you mount the cylinders and pistons, it just protects the connecting rods from the case. Now obviously those are going to come off as we prepare to install the pistons. You can leave them on, you can leave the rubber bands on if you wish until the pistons are installed, and then you would, in that case, you'd remove them just before you put the cylinders on. Or you can pull them off ahead of time if you want. It's really kind of up to you. The nice part about the rubber bands is they allow you to keep the pistons centered like that. The only other thing you need to think about is we need to protect this inside space here, this opening down into the cases, during the installation process. And what I mean by that is you don't want to drop anything down in there. That would be catastrophic. If you drop one of those circlips, something goes down in there, that will ruin your day. It will probably ruin your week, and it'd be heartbreaking. So whether I leave these rubber bands on or not, either way I need to stuff these openings. I think I'm going to do that with clean, fresh paper towel so it's very easily removed. But I want to protect the lower end from inadvertently dropping something. Those little tiny circlips would be real easy to drop down in there mistakenly. And again, that's to be avoided at all costs. So I'm going to go get my paper towel. I'm going to wipe this area down just a little bit. It's been sitting for quite some time. Make sure it's clean. It's been covered with plastic, but just in case, and we'll move on to stuffing these voids here temporarily, and then we'll see about getting those pistons installed. You'll notice I pulled these rubber bands up about as high as they will go just to get them out of the way for stuffing this case. That also allows me to still keep those connecting rods centered in their respective bores. So I'm just going to take a piece of clean paper towel, and I'm going to stuff it into the opening there. Like that. And then for good measure, I'm going to take some masking tape, and I'm going to run a couple of pieces of tape across the top of that, like that, just to make sure I've got that space covered. It might seem like I'm being overly cautious here. I don't think I am. I'm just not going to take any chances of dropping those circlips down into that case. That would not be good. Excuse my arm if I get in the way of the camera here. There. Now essentially, I have that sealed off. If a circlip was to fall, it would probably likely hit and bounce and slide down and end up down on the top of the lift, which I have padded with an old sheet. Chances are then it wouldn't even roll away, it'd just fall and stay. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Before I move over to the other side, what I'm going to do is lower these rubber bands and then change the position of the connecting rods like that, so that I have this one all the way to the top. And I'll move around to the other side now and stuff that case. I've got everything about ready to go. You can see I've got the right connecting rod raised just about as far as it goes vertically, because I wanted it centered in the case opening. You can see down below I've got all my tools and pieces and parts set up and ready to go. I can't overemphasize enough cleanliness. My hands have been washed. Everything's nice and clean. I got a clean, that's actually an old pillowcase that was freshly washed that I've got down. So everything's very clean. The parts have been cleaned. The tools have been cleaned. Cleanliness is real important here. I did want to share with you one minor change I made to the puller, the piston pin puller I had talked about some time ago in a video. I'll be pulling this way, the way this right now is oriented. I'll be pulling this is the piston pin. Be pulling it this way. I decided to take a piece of 1/2-inch copper. That's what you see here under my left thumb. I have a bunch of it left over from various projects in my pole barn, so I just measured and cut this piece of 1/2-inch copper off. You can cut that at any length you want, and you can even cut multiples if you need multiples as you pull the part and you want to change the size of the tube that you're pulling it into. And that's to allow me to maintain grip on the threads here, because the threads on the rod, or on the bolt rather, are not full length, and they stop right about, I think, here, where my fingernail is. So I can cut multiples of these if I need to, and it's inexpensive, easy to work with. I've got a washer here where the copper will bear against the piston. And again, as I shared with you when I made this piston pin pull originally, you just work with what you got. It doesn't have to be complicated. Sockets would probably work, but I thought, this 1/2-inch copper would be just about right. So that's one minor change, but that also highlights the fact that you have to sometimes MacGyver these things and deal with what you got. One of the first things we're going to install is the wrist pin or gudgeon pin bearing, which fits inside of the top of the connecting rod. I have two different kinds of lubricants here. I have one of my favorite assembly lubes. I'll be using some of that, as well as a very lightweight 3-in-1 oil that you'll see here in a minute while I use that. For this connecting rod upper bearing, I'm going to use the assembly lube right here, and I'm just going to put a little bit of that on the bearing. The reason I'm using assembly lube versus like a good 2-stroke oil is because it stays in place better than an oil will. So I'm just going to lube that up really well. It's a very thick, it doesn't run off like 2-stroke oil would. This bearing sees a lot of shock, and especially on startup when it's dry, the engine's generally dry. So for something like this, I use assembly lube and just put the bearing in place like you can see right there. Now we're going to go ahead and prepare to install the piston. Now keep in mind, like we have talked about before, that arrow right there points to the exhaust, so it points that way, points towards the front of the bike. That's virtually always the case on 2-strokes, at least virtually every 2-stroke I've ever seen. In terms of the piston pin itself, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to use a little 3-in-1, a very light machine oil. And the reason I'm using this rather than assembly lube is it's much thinner, and the tolerances here in the piston are so tight that assembly lube is just going to get pressed out or pushed out anyway. In fact, much of this oil will be also, but at least it gives me a fighting chance here. We'll see if we can't get that started like that. Now in terms of positioning of the piston pin, You'll notice I'm not going to worry about the ring positioning right now. I can refine that later. What I need to do is I'm going to put my puller through, and I'm going to go ahead and mount everything up. Get it started here. I'm trying to do this without getting my body parts in the way of everything that's going on here. And I'm going to center things up. Getting that piston pin in the middle of the connecting rod is obviously one of the key elements here. So I'm just going to try to finesse it in a little bit. I think I've got everything about centered, and you got to just fiddle around and go by feel. So I'm going to put a wrench on that nut, like that. I'm going to put a ratcheting wrench I have on the opposite side, and we're going to just go ahead and see if we can't pull that piston pin right into place. I think I've just about run out of threads. So what's happened here is I've run out of threads, so now I'm going to have to reposition my tools to be able to pull this back, because I have about, a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch of the piston pin sticking out over here on the right side. At this point I don't have to worry about anything coming apart, because it's not going to. Take the components out of the way. And now re-rig this using that socket that I drilled earlier in the previous video. You'll notice inside of the piston this groove right here. Hope that's in focus for you. Right there. That groove is where those circlips will go. So I'm going to continue. I took a look at where this that groove for the circlip was on this far right side, and it's not exposed yet, so I'm going to have to pull that pin in a little bit further until I can see that groove. Not quite, but I'm getting close. I'm going to go ahead and remove the puller. because I have to check on both sides of the piston. I think that's probably about right, but I got to check this side now. I think the piston pin, wrist pin, is pretty close to being centered right now. So what I'm going to do now is install the circlips. In terms of the circlips, you can see right there, there's just a spring type of arrangement. It fits inside of that groove in there. I usually use high quality forceps like you can see here. I've had these for many years. You probably have seen them in previous videos. They have serrations. Let me show you here. They have serrations on the jaws on both sides. And these work great for grabbing that clip like that and pulling it together without it slipping. Now I'm going to do my best to get in here without interfering with the shot with my head, but so you'll have to forgive me because this is a pretty tight space if my head gets in the way. There, that went pretty easy. In terms of the circlip positioning, I've heard and read all kinds of positions and variations of how that clip is to be positioned. I've torn down many original bikes over the years, original from the manufacturer, and I've seen these clips in all different positions. However, what I usually do is, as you can see here, I just position the pin with the opening. See that opening right there? Usually at the 6 o'clock or the bottom position. Or you can position it at the top. It doesn't make any difference. In reality, I'm not sure it makes any difference at all, but that's just the way I do it. I put the opening at the bottom. More importantly, you want to make sure that that clip is in the groove. You want to make sure that it's, let me get a better purchase of that to show you. You want to make sure it's completely in the groove, because if it's not, that would be a serious problem for you. So this side's installed. I'm going to go ahead over the other side. I'll reposition and we'll put that second circlip in. Again, the same kind of deal. I'm going to take my small forceps like that and see if we can't get this in easily. Easier said than done, of course. Notice I keep my finger over the circlip when I'm going to compress it and install it, because if something pops loose, I don't want to go shooting across the room. That's happened to me before. So the right piston is done, it's all mounted. I'm going to remove this tape and the stuffing from the case simply because I have to rotate this engine so that the left connecting rod comes up so I can get access to it. Now rotate the engine to bring this left cylinder up. I'm just going to drape this around like that, primarily to prevent anything from slipping down in there, i.e. the circlips for this cylinder, the left cylinder, just in case. Can't be too careful. I went ahead and installed the left piston off camera. It was identical in process to what you saw on the right side. It went very smoothly. I didn't have any issues with it. I clocked the circlips at the 6 o'clock position opening, which is at the bottom on this piston, and I double checked both pistons to make sure the circlips were well seated, which is something you will want to do. I can't reiterate enough that you want to make sure your circlips are well seated, otherwise you will have a serious failure when you start your engine, or eventually after running the engine. So the pistons are done. Next step will be to install the cylinder heads, or the cylinders and cylinder heads. I'm going to leave these rubber bands on for now, and I'll remove those just before we go ahead and mount the cylinders. At this point, I think I'm going to close this video and call this a wrap. I appreciate you watching. Any issues or questions, drop me a note. Otherwise, thanks for watching.